Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today, continuing on with the Women's Prize shortlist, we have Claire Kilroy's Soldier Sailor. I realise my version will look a little bit different to sort of fairly regular ones. I had an advanced copy of this, and so this is a sort of proof version. And as a result, don't be alarmed if yours looks slightly different. But this is one that I was delighted to see make the long list and then the short list, just because for me, this was one of my favourite books from last year. I think it's an exceptional piece of writing. I won't really go into too much by way of spoilers in this video. If I do feel like I'm going that way, I will kind of flag that. But for the most part, this should be a review that you get to enjoy without spoilers, hopefully. But let's get started talking about this book. So this book is, I think, a really interesting and really lyrical book, but a very funny one at the same time. The core story is focused around a mother looking after her young son, who she sort of refers to sort of as sort of soldier and sailor throughout the book. And he is this sort of odd little, well, I say odd little character. In many ways, he isn't. He's a toddler and he's a child, and that's, children move and do things in mysterious ways. But it's her sort of chronicling her life, trying to look after this child. And by turns, we get the sort of the funny bits of motherhood, but also these really sort of horrible moments for her where she feels isolated and alone, or where she feels that she's not getting any of the support that she needs. And what this really does set up throughout the book is sort of a lot of sort of struggle between her and her partner to really reconcile what it is to be a parent. And so sometimes this is feeling that her husband isn't supporting her nearly enough. Sometimes it's her feeling that he's doing it all wrong. And sometimes it's just that she would much rather be left to do it by herself, or that, all of this is ridiculous anyway. And so she just sort of moves through this world in a really complex way, because she's just sort of not really happy for a lot of it. But then there are these little moments of joy, and she'll be sat watching him in the playground and will observe all of the kind of absurdity and silliness of it, and how happy he is running around and doing things. And so it's basically her sort of re-experiencing the world through him, all of which I found really interesting and entertaining. And I think there's something so brilliant about the way that she writes in this very close, intense sort of tone. So we are sort of watching through this lens of this woman in such an intense way that we basically get every single thought, and those thoughts sometimes are incredibly joyous, sometimes they're incredibly scattered. She sort of will change mood mid-sentence, and I think that's the real beauty and power of this book. It is unsparing and unflinching in its portrayal of motherhood, and I think as a result sort of does something really quite exceptional, because it's a book that very easily, I think, could have slid into melodrama. It's a book where I think it would be so easy to sort of have all of these big moods and big emotions just firing off the page and becoming really overwhelming. But actually, as it is, it's a relatively slim novel. It's very focused and very tight. And so as a result, we get this real insight into this woman's life. And without going into any spoilers, we sort of see how this struggle of sort of parenthood and motherhood places a really big pressure on her and her relationship. And we see that she starts looking for any kind of acknowledgement from anybody outside. So even at one point, just watching other people play with their children, she has these intense feelings of joy and jealousy and rage and all of these other things kind of coursing through her. And it's so interesting, when anybody shows her the smallest bit of kindness, she almost doesn't know what to do with this. She sometimes finds it really overwhelming, and she sort of just feels like she needs that sort of love from them, whilst at the same time just feeling an incredible amount of guilt, because everything is poured into her young son. And so that kind of dominates everything, kind of at her expense. She's a sort of a vehicle for keeping him alive, essentially, for a large part of the book, or at least that's how she often sees herself. So much of her life is the mundanity of washing and going and buying things. I mean, I think in many ways this book really engages with this idea of the mental load in a really powerful way. There's a brilliant graphic novel about it, I think called Emma, I want to say. I'll find it and put it in the comments below. And it really deals with this idea that often, particularly in heterosexual relationships, particularly heterosexual relationships where there's a child involved, there is often a tendency, and by all means, this is not every couple, but where one person, typically the woman, is the one who project manages every single task, and as a result sort of is given the sort of default role of running the house and doing everything to do with childcare. And when there is support from the male partner, that is typically still project managed. It's still, you know, it's still sort of like, hey, here's a list, I need you to go and do this thing for me, instead of somebody naturally picking up the laundry and just doing it. And so this book really plays with that quite early on, but also starts to invert some of that idea, because what we start to get a sense of in this book is how much of, you know, is it, how much of it is that she is burnt out doing absolutely everything, which she is for a large part of the book. How much of it is also that she is so determined to do everything that actually there is nothing left for the other person to do. You know, she naturally goes in and starts doing all the laundry and then gets annoyed if anyone else tries to do the laundry, and so does it all herself. And it sort of plays with these ideas of mental load, weaponizing competence, all of these sorts of things in this really interesting way. And I think it's in a very funny way. One of my favorite lines in the book is just where, you know, she says about him saying nothing, and she's like, well, he said nothing, but it was the way he said it. And I love that. I think this is, yeah, to which he said nothing, but it was the way he said it. And that is just so indicative of how so much of this book works, which is this very wry, knowing sense of us as the reader often being able to see slightly beyond the perspective of our narrator, to really focus in on what's actually happening maybe as well. You know, we can sort of tell that things are fractured within her relationship with her partner, but she often doesn't necessarily put it in so many words, at least early into the book. We know fairly early on into the book that there are various other things about how she views her son's safety, and we sometimes can see beyond that to kind of know that maybe the child is doing all right, actually. And this is sort of, you know, coming from someone who's a very concerned parent in the book. And that's kind of why it's sort of slightly different to maybe how we perceive it. But then also there are these moments where it kind of inverts that again, where we start to think maybe actually this guy isn't too bad, and then maybe we start to realize maybe he is. And, you know, again, without spoiling anything, but I think this book just plays with that really interestingly, of the sheer sort of disjunct between these two people, and between her sort of really strong feelings about trying to raise her child and be this sort of protective figure, but also where those limitations might be. And so I think it's a book that does quite a lot very cleverly, but it's also just deeply entertaining. I think apart from the darker themes of this book, this is deeply funny. It plays in the absurd. It just sort of really looks at things from so many interesting angles, and it's so tightly written that I just found this book utterly compelling. I just sort of breezed through it and just really wanted this story to never really end. It feels so well observed and so well captured. And I think it's fitting that Anne Enright, another shortlistee for the Women's Prize, is someone who also blurbed this book, talking about how insightful it is. Because Anne Enright is also a writer who I think is very, very good at those sorts of interpersonal observations. And so I just absolutely adored this book. I think it's very, very clever. It's very, very good. And yeah, one of my favourite books from last year, easily. And as you may be able to tell, probably one of my picks for the win from the 4 that I've read so far at the time of recording this. Anyway, take care. Speak to you all soon, and I hope you are enjoying the Women's Prize shortlist.